Welcome back, everyone. I am here with our last presentation of the day, and I promise you it's a treat. I have had the privilege of just barely getting to know our presenter, Bianca McCall, and she is a marriage and family therapist. We have that in common. Bianca is a retired professional women's basketball player. Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Bianca, in her marriage and family therapy experience and in her advocacy experience now, is very much encouraging empowerment and lived experience, and you're going to hear more about how she does it. And she's going to tell you how to get out there and find her TED Talk once it is fully produced, because she just recently did it. So we're going to be loving listening to Bianca, so I turn the time over to her now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, gosh, the reception for me being a professional athlete, I was like, yeah, I mean, if you guys would have seen me about 40 pounds lighter and a little quicker and late 90s, I was a beast. So yeah, you brought me back a little bit. Thank you for that. And I heard MFT, yeah, no, I heard there was a ton of social workers in the room, so I was a little nervous. Yeah, social workers in the room. Hey, listen, I don't want any problems. I don't want any problems with social workers. Yeah, no, all helpers, all healers, all doing some wonderful work, and I am both humbled and honored to stand before you today and give you a presentation on problem gambling from the context of looking at elite performers and athletes and why it's so prevalent among that group. As well as be able to talk about arousal therapy, or arousal theory rather, and motivation, and those links between that and the prevalence in problem gambling within that ecosystem. I'll get acclimated with technology a little bit. So on the golf course yesterday, me and my powerhouse of three, they carried me all afternoon. Denise was far too kind with my game, but we did fall into the discussion that sometimes, it's important to remember that some things like consumption, whether it be like food consumption, alcohol, even problem gambling, isn't a problem for everybody, and so we have to remember that in our conversations, but I think that there's that fine line, because we also have to remember that it's the human condition that we all have some level of impact, right, for problematic behaviors that occur. And, that level of impact, it changes the ways that we view ourselves, right, and we, in turn, self-love, or love ourselves and care for ourselves, and then the ways that we view our relationships with the world, with others, other people, and matter. So with that, I kind of lead into this slide in all of my presentations, because with that being the true definition of trauma, we're all exposed to traumatic experiences unknowingly, right? Consciously and unconsciously, and in varying ways, whether it be from passed down from past generations to childhood traumas to experiences where we're repeatedly exposed to different traumatic events that we could experience directly or indirectly, vicariously through the work that we do. But we're all kind of on this spectrum where there's varying levels of impact to that. And I just want to take some time to honor that and to validate that, and to strongly recommend that with all the content and subject matter that we're considering today, that we identify some ways to self-care today, as well as tomorrow and throughout the weekend. And during this time, as we transition out of kind of the virtual world, the kids are saying, virtual life is the real life, right, in real life. But as we transition, from Zoom rooms and meetings and conferences even to coming together in person, that's one thing that we really should attention ourselves to, is kind of that life balance and that self-care. I know for me, I'm one of those people, I share my lived experience and I infuse it in everything that I say and present. And so I'll be vulnerable, I'll be honest. I am way overextended. I've got so many things on my plate because I think that I can do so many things. We were also talking about yesterday being in those virtual rooms, and I'm like, oh, I can multitask, and I can be in 3 rooms at once, and I can be on a phone call, at the same time. And so that's why I say self-care and being attention to the supports that we have around us during this time in general is going to be so important, especially for our helpers and healers that are in the room. And while my background is in suicide prevention, which is why I've got the Lifeline resource up, I do recognize where I am and what the purpose and where we all are in our journeys today. And National Problem Gambling Helpline, 1-800-522-4700. And I get excited to do these presentations because the team that's helped me kind of develop the visuals, they put some pretty fancy pictures of me up. So I'm not vain, but I also have to give some credit to the design team and the branding team for making me look good as much as possible. It's pretty cool because I was saying I recognize some of the faces in the room, and for those that don't know me or not familiar with me, my name is Bianca McCall. I'm a suicidologist and an expert in the subjects of mental, emotional, and behavioral health continuum. I'm also a TEDx speaker, and Denise had alluded to, I just recently recorded a TEDx Wilmington talk, and in a few weeks that'll be available at TED.org. So if you do some light internet stalking and follow me, I'll definitely give you some updates on when that'll be released. But we've got a lot of great content. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. Go MFTs. And I'm 11 years the founder and the executive director of what was an integrated behavioral health care clinic called Desert Rose Counseling Group. And at the start of the pandemic, I, much like much of you in the room, had the time and the space to kind of reprioritize and get creative on how I connected with the community and continued to help and continue to do this work. So what once was an integrated behavioral health care clinic turned into a large focus on trauma-informed training and workshop and activation events for mental health campaigns, especially with the underlying mental health pandemic that has been brewing for the last several years. And then I also, stepped into the tech space, and I almost came up with a little zip-up hoodie, the full zip-up hoodies, because that's, when you're in the tech space, that's what you wear, So I'm just getting used to those digs. But I got into the tech space when I was divinely guided, and I met with some developers from Microsoft, and we co-developed a mobile health application to focus on peer supports. It's anonymous, which is pretty awesome, and it gives a good combat against stigma and shame, and that is called Reach In Now, and I'll give you some more information on how you could learn more about Reach In Now. But for me, for those that are familiar with me, I typically start by sharing my story, with each presentation. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One, I'm a retired women's basketball player, and that means something. That means that I get to retell those glory stories over and over and over. And each time, the nuances, it may get a little bit better, each time. And so I guarantee, even if you have sat through one of my presentations, this one's going to be better, even better. But I also, because, as a basketball player, I attribute a lot of my binary thinking to that culture, to the athletic culture. Binary thinking, I mean, like, we win or we lose. It's championship or failure. There is no glory in second place, second, third, fourth place, right? Another binary concept in athletics is we're either hurt or we're injured, right? And there's some consequence to either one. And binary thinking, it could be dangerous. It could be very dangerous, and certainly limit our perspective, and certainly when it pertains to our mental, emotional, and behavioral health. I want to talk about another great picture, if I do say so myself. But binary thinking, it could aid and lend to the denial that a problem really even exists for us. It can also reinforce, barriers to help seeking. I want to share my story about, late 1990s. I was an all-American athlete. I was ranked 11th in the nation, which meant that somebody who was absolutely wrong decided that there were 10 girls better than me at basketball. And I always say that, being an elite athlete in the late 90s was equivalent to being a rock star of sorts, because this is, pre 9/11, so literally, as soon as you step off of the plane, you've got a swarm of aspiring athletes, young people that are asking for your autograph, and you've got teen moms that are offering you those foods that you love, that you don't gain any weight until about 24 years later, and yeah, I mean, it's everybody wants you. You're desirable, as an elite athlete. And as a young person, that can be very confusing to IRL, in real life, right? So at that time, I would take those steps off of the plane. I would go through the entourage of folks that were looking up to me, and then I would go and take a tour of the campus, which would end on the hardwood floor of the basketball arena. And they would dim the lights, and the music would start, and the announcer comes on and announces my name, my hometown, adds a few inches to my height, and begins to really just convince me that this is where I should begin my journey, my pursuit of championship, which I often call chasing the carrot. Okay? Chasing the carrot. And what that is in reference to is that we're trained as elite athletes, as high performers. We're trained to kind of adopt and to groom this belief system at which we end with, we're willing to leave it all on the line for something. We're willing to die for something, right? We're willing to give it all, no matter if we're hurt or we're injured, for our teammates, for the name on the front of our jersey, for the organization. There's this belief system that's very particular to those that are willing to die. And that's really important in the work that I do in suicide prevention, is what is the belief system to where somebody is willing to die to change their circumstances. So for me, I take that incredible opportunity to prove to them that there's not 10 girls that are more deserving of this opportunity to pursue championship with this university. And I want to mention that championship, it's not a ring, it's not a trophy, it's not a belt, it's a status. Championship is a status, and for a young person that's pursuing championship within the respective fields of competition, of play, of work, the status, the perceived status, is that you will be an equitable member within that organization someday. An equitable member, right? And a lot of us, we can relate to that because we too are chasing that carrot, but will there ever be a circumstance where we will be an equitable member? Well, that's arguable. I'm not going to burst anybody's bubble today, but it's arguable. And there are three core beliefs that we kind of navigate to or migrate to in order to continue to pursue something that is so uncertain. And that's really where there's a link with problem gambling and with elite athletes, is that you have that uncertainty, that reward, right? The uncertainty reward is actually what's driving, our motivating our behavior to continue to gamble, right? So those three concepts are excellence, in all things that we do. It's integrity above all else, and it's service or performance before self. Now those core concepts, you could see kind of that crossover where it's going to impact, or that's really how we groom, we train our military, our law enforcement, right? Elite athletes and performers alike. Those three core concepts. Excellence in all things we do is oftentimes confused with perfection. Integrity above all else is oftentimes defined by how able and willing we are to endure suffering and pain. Now, I recall being an elite athlete and coach asking me several times, are you hurt or are you injured? McCall, are you hurt or are you injured? Well, which one did you think I wanted to be? Injured, hurt? I don't want to be either one, no. The one that I always said I was hurt. Because if you're hurt, you're expected to endure that pain, that suffering. You get your butt back out there and you play. You play hurt. Injured, or injury, in certainly the way that we address any type of injury. Right? Medical model is to isolate, to extract, to treat or rehab, and to throw you back in there, right? But oftentimes those systems, they're either unchanged or they've had to change because of the injury. So there's some maladaptive changes, right? We're making some decisions based on injury and fear, right? And so you don't have that status. You don't maintain that position, that role, that status, right, to be able to pursue championship or continue that pursuit. So yeah, integrity above all else is really leads into the last one, service and performance before self. It's you have personal integrity, you have relational integrity, you have organizational integrity if you sacrifice yourself, right? So putting before, we as high performers, as elite athletes, we consider that to be service and performance at the sacrifice of self. No matter what I'm going through, what I'm feeling, I'm going to perform. So for me, I take all of this. I'm a 17-year-old girl, right? Again, much thinner, quicker, more agile. And I go and play some pickup basketball with a few of the girls on the team. And I'm playing some of the best basketball of my life because I've got a point to prove, for sure. And one of my teammates throws me the ball. I fake like I'm going to swing the ball. I pass it back to my teammate, or at least I think. My defender gets a hand on the ball, deflects it, starts dribbling down towards her basket, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to foul you before I let you score off my turnover, okay? So I'm running full speed. She's running full speed. She does a hard jump stop, goes up to shoot the basket. I go up to block her shot, and on my way up, I feel snap in my left knee. I would, in that moment, tear my ACL, my MCL, my meniscus. For those of you who don't know what those letters mean, it means bad. On my way down, what I landed into was serious injury, an injury that transcended my physical being, my physical body. I landed into a psychological injury. And what I mean by psychological injury is that loss of identity. As a 17-year-old girl, I lost the identity of being invincible, of being an all-American. Nobody's better than me on the court. I also experienced what I call a spiritual injury. And spiritual in the sense that before the injury and throughout my career, I'd always ask myself existential questions like, will people accept me? Will people love me if I can't perform? And to me, anytime I'm talking about existence and purpose, I call that spiritual. So I had a spiritual injury because the harsh reality was, no, people will not want you. I then became undesirable because I could not perform. And this was proven by the immediate change in affect, much like kind of the change in everybody else's affect. You know, we were clapping for me when I was an athlete before, and then I said, everything snapped to my knee, and then everybody's affect went, oh. And that was the same thing that happened in the gym. And so I go home, I get scheduled for surgery right away, and my very first conversation, right, that didn't involve, can you play, you know, when can you return? The first conversation was from the orthopedic surgeon who said, Bianca, you're coming out of your anesthesia. You're not waking up from this nightmare. However, I've got a black button here for you, and I just want you to push this anytime you're in pain. This is going to aid your pain relief. You do not have to ask permission for pain relief. And that was the most significant thing to say to any child that is not in control of her circumstances, is that you do not have to ask permission to be out of pain. So what did I do with this responsibility as a 17-year-old girl, the little black button? Every time I was awake, I was in pain because I couldn't differentiate between physical, psychological, and spiritual pain. So I didn't know, unbeknownst to me, and this is back, it didn't help, this is back when insurance was really great, so I got to spend like a good week and a half after surgery pushing the black button, but unbeknownst to me, what I was developing was dependency on morphine, on narcotics. So nobody had any conversations with me about this, though. This is me years later realizing what I had gone through. So they say a week and a half later, Bianca, you don't have to go home, but you got to get out of here. I'm holding on to the bed rail, and I'm like, no, please, it hurts. Don't make me go. I am sobbing. I am not kidding you. And they are prying my hands off the bed rail, strapping me into the wheelchair, wheeling me out to my parents' car, and throwing paper prescriptions at me. And saying, you'll be fine. Take these every 4 to 6 hours for pain. Pain to a young person. So every 4 to 6 hours turned every 1 to 3 hours. Every time I was awake, I was popping pills. 2 weeks. 2 weeks is what it took for me to end up back in the hospital, this time from an overdose. I opened my eyes 2 days later. And mind you, my father's a retired corrections officer. My mother is a retired ED nurse. So I woke up in the same hospital that she worked at. So I opened my eyes to my mother mouthing to me, I'm going to kill you when we get home. And my father, again, the affect has changed because now I had lost another aspect of my identity as a sane person, right? Because culturally even, my family's looking at me like, we don't do that. You have lost your mind. So now I'm not even a stable, sane person. And then the first thing the doctor says to me is, Bianca, we think because of what you were going through, because of your suicide attempt, that you are experiencing something called bipolar disorder. And this is late 90s. This is when, I'm not saying we know a whole heck of a lot now, but this is when we really didn't know. This is the first time that I ever heard the word suicide and the word bipolar. So again, and I can't stress enough for those of you who do work with young people, we rely on the adults in the room to give us that language, right? To not only model how to be resilient, but to give us the language to help us define our experiences. Because it's not that we don't understand our experiences. We understand pain and hurt and emptiness and hopelessness and despair. We understand that very well. I'll give you some statistics in a little bit about how much our young people understand those concepts. But it's the language. And so at this crucial time when I have an opportunity to rebuild, restructure my identity, I'm being told by the adults in the room that I've lost my mind, that I'm injured, I'm undesirable, I just attempted suicide, how can I do that? And I'm bipolar. So being the elite athlete that I am and high performers, this is what we all have in common, is that whatever our coaches say, whatever our trainers say, whatever our doctors say, if it stands in the way of pursuing our championship, we'll do it. We'll accept it. We accept that identity. So I said, great, how do you treat bipolar? Guess how you treat bipolar? Medications. So my biochemistry would change for the rest of my life. And you combine those circumstances with entering into a multi-billion-dollar industry, the NC2A, for my first real job. And I don't know how many of you know how much the organizations that you work for, how much they bring in each year, but for my first employer, multi-billions of dollars, the expectations for my performance were very high. No matter what you're going through, service, performance, before self. And then you add in that I'm going to college. The college lifestyle provides a perfect recipe for disaster for mental health. Right? Disrupted sleep, poor eating habits, excessive alcohol consumption, persistently volatile relationships that we're engaging in for the first time in a lot of our lives. And then you add the performance factor, the elite athletes. We're balancing being a student, we're balancing being a performer and being told, sometimes subtly, sometimes more obvious, but being told that you are obligated to sacrifice yourself for this opportunity, for the organization which has invested in you, has bet on you. So you combine all of those, perfect recipe for disaster. So while I'm suffering in silence, I walk into practice facility about halfway through the season and learn that one of my teammates has died by suicide. So I experienced survivor's remorse times 1,000 for a couple of reasons. One's which you can guess, right? For me, I saw the signs and the symptoms, which the peers, the family members, the friends, what I call the entourage, we usually do recognize first those signs and symptoms. And they could be, again, obvious, they could be subtle. I recognized those signs and symptoms because there was a lot that she was doing that I was doing. But I never had a conversation with her or anybody else about it, and I felt really shameful, really guilty because of that. And for a lot of the rest of my childhood, the rest of my youth, right? So now, 40 pounds, more and things like that, I can look back and say, well, nobody ever had the conversation with me. How was I supposed to know what to say? But I questioned myself for years. Had I said something? Had I said what I saw? Could I have saved a life? Well, then I also had survivor's remorse because I then turned into this master self-sabotager. I thought to myself, I'm going to prove my higher power wrong and say that I wasn't worth saving. You should have saved this one. So what I mean by master self-sabotage is, okay, I'm going to do all the high-risk behaviors. I'm going to gamble with my life, right? And never really understanding, never really having the conversations or the language to be able to know what was actually going on with me, mind, body, and really just kind of existentially with my spirit, right? No conversations to determine that I had been dealing with this chemical imbalance. I had been dealing with this pursuit to championship in my brain, that I didn't really have control over. And so there's a belief system, that goes into, this motivation to pursue that championship. And for me, I was coached, I was trained to focus on my job, which was to play basketball. Focus on the physical nature of my lived experience. And I did that until my body just completely broke down. So I finished out my college career. I went and played professionally in Italy and couldn't walk, back hurt, knees hurt, surgery after surgery. Psychologically, I was just done. I could not rehab anymore. I could not be isolated any longer. I was in a dangerous place, being isolated because I was injured, being isolated because I was on a different continent than my support systems. And then back then, with the electronic situation, it shorted out all my desktop that was dialing up AOL to be able to talk to my family. So I was completely on an island. So at that point, I say, okay, what am I going to do? Well, this is where the fun story begins of how I ended up in the fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. And it's funny because in my other presentations, I always skip this part of the story. I always say, I don't know if it's completely relevant to tell this time. So you guys get to hear one of the first times told stories of how I ended up in Las Vegas. What happens in this presentation room needs to stay in this presentation room. So I go home. I'm from Northern California in the beautiful San Francisco Bay Area, just north of San Francisco, in a town called Santa Rosa. It's super expensive. Beautiful, super expensive to live. So I go home and I start living with my father, and about the second time that he asked me to do the dishes and come home by a certain time, I was like, this is not gonna work, sir. So, and remind you, retired corrections, So that worked for about 17 days. And a group of friends of mine that I played AU basketball with, we all turned 21 around the same time, and so we said, hey, let's go to Vegas and celebrate. So we hop in the car, we head to Vegas, we stay at the Paris Hotel and Casino, and I'm gambling for the first time in my life. So what's the game that I start off with? Not your slots, I start off with roulette. Because I'm the dangerous kind of girl, right? So I start off playing roulette, and I put some money down, and Black 13 hits, and I've got a little stack on Black 13. I win $5,000, you guys. For a 21-year-old, $5,000 first time in Vegas, that was $1 million. That translated to $1 million in today's time. It's kind of like $1 million in today's time anyway, right? 5,000. So we get in the car, we go back to my hometown, talk to my dad. First thing I said, Dad, Mom, Granny, I'm moving to Vegas. And they were like, oh no, oh no. And the reason why that's such a significant part of the story is because everything that I've told you thus far, and we're talking about chemical imbalances and what we know, right, from gambling, is that the action of gambling is doing some of the same things, right, in the brain as taking drugs, abusing drugs. It's lighting up the same receptors, pleasure pathways, frontal lobes, right? It's doing the same things. And for somebody like me with that predisposition of chemical dependency and things like that, it's no wonder why I was moving to Vegas after that single win. My arousal, my psychological arousal was through the roof. And this very much plays into the cycles or the patterns of performers and elite athletes. We're going to talk about arousal, hopefully. Yeah. So we'll talk about arousal theory and how that lends to our behavioral health. And for those of you who aren't familiar with arousal theory, I highly suggest that you do some research into it, because I won't have time today to get too much into it. But arousal theory for motivation, it really suggests that people are driven to perform certain actions in order to maintain an optimal level of psychological arousal, right? So when we talk about substance misuse and abuse, right? We reach this certain level where dopamine's being released in our brains and things like that, and it gets to a point to where our receptors stop producing dopamine naturally because it's thinking, oh, I've got to regulate this, I've got to manage this, so I'm going to shut down because we've got too much going on. And then the shutdown is when you get some of those symptoms of, oh, I'm motivated to do some behaviors to get those levels back up. Right? So, maintaining that optimal level of psychological arousal is actually a key point or key purpose for elite athletes and performers to reach peak performance, right? So the idea that as an athlete, I'm being trained, I'm being coached, I'm being motivated in ways that increase that arousal so that I have a better chance of reaching peak performance. So I'm getting cursed at, I'm being called by my last name, I'm going to have, are you hurt, you injured, get your butt out there, you're not playing well, I'm getting picked apart. And meanwhile, I'm a young woman, a young girl, right? So what happens when you're getting picked apart and prodded and poked to try to reach this high optimum psychological arousal, is what happens is anytime that it drops, you're experiencing that insecurity about your abilities to perform at that high level, to sustain or maintain that high level. Insecurity, especially for our young people, especially for our performers, especially for our athletes, is also a dangerous contributor to our mental, emotional, and behavioral health. Gambling, like I mentioned before, there's the uncertainty of reward. And we're essentially doing the same things as performers, as athletes. There's this uncertainty that we will eventually achieve or capture that carrot. We continue to chase based on the uncertainty, and we're being told if you just abide by those core values, you'll get there. In addition, the parallels are with gambling, you've got lights and sounds that kind of feed into that, right? And for performers, for athletes, that's a familiar space for us. Lights, sounds, cameras, action. And then the thought of you're made to feel like a winner even when you're losing. Well, that is the best thing for a performer, to win no matter what. It's risk-free, because engaging in gambling is risk-free, that we will not experience the risk of losing our status, because we're still winning. They're giving us drinks. They're treating us like rock stars, right? This is feeling like the late 90s, y'all. And then there's that element of, through training, there's the element of we have this locus of control over it, right? Because if coaches, if managers within our ecosystem, if they are employed to help manage and help push us to this optimum level of performance and of psychological arousal, then there's this misconception that that can be controlled. So why would it be any different in a gambling scenario? I can control this. I'm a champion. Another really interesting theory that relates to the subject is catastrophe theory. And this is the idea, or it expands upon the idea that for performers, for athletes, we stress them out, we apply pressure and stress in order to get the result of peak performance. But what makes such a high risk for injury in that is because an athlete, because a performer is already under an enormous amount of stress. And so that only works with balance. And without balance, with too much stress, we have injury, we break. So I wanted to talk about the key stressors. And this is a little bit more targeted towards elite athletes, but a lot of interchangeable concepts between athletes and performers. So the key stressors for high performers and athletes can really be categorized into these three areas or categories. And there's some crossover, between the categories, and there's certainly some crossover between that and problem gambling. But those are competitive stressors, personal stressors, and organizational stressors. Now, competitive stressors are things that have to do with the preparation, injury, pressure, underperforming, expectation, self-presentation, rivalry, major competition, and unexpected success. Personal stressors are work-life interface, family issues, death of a family member or friend, academic commitments, or other work commitments. Organizational stress pertains to the leadership and personal issues. Entourage behavior, that's a huge one, is I really want to implore upon you that our entourage, our support systems, the family members, the friends, the agents have such a huge role in the overall health and resilience of our performers, of our athletes. Other organizational stressors are things like cultural and team issues. And culture is very important because stigma and shame surrounding mental health conditions, and mental health conditions including problem gambling, right, as a behavioral health concern. The cultural rules and the norms have all to do with whether or not a performer or an athlete is going to come forward and be able to identify that there's a problem and come forward and do some help seeking. There's logistical and environmental issues, performance and other personal issues having to do with finance, career transition, and media attention. And finances is a big one, right? There's always or historically been a lack of transparency when it comes to our finances, right? And so nobody wants to let somebody know how much money they really have. And in most cases, behaviorally, or going back to culture, is we portray or project a financial well-being that is not IRL in real life. And so when we do things like we gamble and we hit the jackpot, we come away with $5,000, then that is a moment where we're able to kind of connect. We lack that dissonance, that anxiety that we are not who we are portraying ourselves to be, but all of a sudden we are. The carrot seems more attainable. So the stress to be able to achieve or have these experiences, it weighs on our performers and our athletes. Another important category of stressors, which athletes may experience, are traumatic stressors. And these traumatic stressors can be experienced on and off their sport, or in and outside of their sport. But they can include things like bullying and cyberbullying and physical abuse and psychological abuse, harassment, and gambling. So while it's important to understand that stress for performers is often seen as a natural motivator for peak performance, there has to be the healthy balance, because too much of that stress, it can cause injury and disqualification from their pursuit of championship. You guys still with me? I don't know, it got a little quiet in here. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the work that I do through Reach In Now. And there's a philosophy that really shifts the paradigm from what I talked about before when we talk about injury, how we treat, how we identify, how we treat, the ways we think about, the ways that we talk about injury. And I'm not just saying physical injury, I'm saying psychological injury and spiritual injury. As a culture, like I said, we isolate, we extract, we treat, we rehab, we throw back in there. Isolation, as we know, is a key contributor to further injury and to end stages of some of this dis-ease causing disease, and can be lethal. So shifting the paradigm and not just extracting and healing what the perceived injury or the perceived injured person to be, but let's start healing the ecosystem. Let's start identifying the needs of every stakeholder within an ecosystem. The needs and the impact. Remember what we said to open is that all of us have some level of impact. We're all exposed to trauma on a daily basis. So the Reach In Now philosophy, it's to engage, to empower the entire ecosystem. And targeting the three major stakeholder groups from an elite performer ecosystem is, the first is going to be the performer. The performer is going to be the first stakeholder group. The second is going to be the entourage, what I was telling you about, the peers, the family, the friends, and the agents. And the third is going to be the managers of the system. So in sports, it's going to be your coaches, your team managers. It's going to be your health workers, team psychologists, your clinicians, physiotherapists, psychotherapists, anyone who can connect to pathways to care. So those are the three major stakeholder groups. And for each of those stakeholder groups, we have to go into this with the understanding that we're all accountable for the psychological safety of the ecosystem. So the person that's injured is not the only one that's responsible to heal and to get back out and to support the life of the ecosystem. We're all responsible in that psychological safety, and we're all responsible in that healing process for ourselves and for the performer. If I were to tell you that there are like a top 5 stressors for the performer, for the elite athlete ecosystem, what do you think those are? And you could just yell at me. What do you think the top five stressors are? Okay, performance. What else? And I'm sorry, pressure, fear of loss. And I'm sorry? Conditions in the contract, so maybe that security, that stability for your status, for your role and position. All these things are the top stressors for performance or performers and elite athletes. And when you translate those to belief systems, it's, I don't feel like I'm deserving. I don't feel like I'm desirable. I don't feel like I have power. I don't feel like I can make change. Right? That's how those stressors are translated to belief system. Those are the core belief systems of people who are willing to die to change their circumstances. And when I say willing to die, it's very different than wanting to die. And I say this in all my presentations because this is a common misconception in the helping field, is that we think when somebody's in crisis, when we think that somebody's lost it all, right? They've lost it all gambling, they come in crisis, they've lost their housing, they're turning to drugs, to alcohol. we think that there's a desire to be in that position, right? Or at the very least, a choice. And poor choices have been made, and that's why you're in this position. But for some of us, there's that belief system. It's exercising those core values that have really been a perfect recipe for disaster when it comes to our mental, emotional, and behavioral health that have contributed to this seeming like a good idea. And I'll give you the example of me 2 weeks after surgery overdosing. As a child, did I want to die? I can honestly stand before you and tell you no. It didn't cross my mind, oh, I want to die, I want to die. I wanted to be out of pain. I was striving for pain relief. And for me, I knew that if I took all those pills, I probably would go to sleep. I thought I may not wake up. But as a 17-year-old girl, I was willing to deal with those consequences if it meant in the present moment I can be out of pain. So that's how powerful the belief systems are of anybody that's in crisis that we're working with. So instead of disciplining and punishing, right, we have a very punitive system. Instead of disciplining behavior and punishing behavior and judging behavior, we have to be investigators of behavior. We have to identify what those belief systems are. And if you don't feel like that's your job within your position, then it is your job to connect that person with somebody who it is within their scope. Thank you. What do you think the top 5 mental health conditions experienced by performers and elite athletes are? And again, you could just shoot them at me. Anxiety, depression, substance use, anger. What else? Fear. Top 5 mental health conditions for performers and elite athletes. Anxiety and stress, nailed that one. Depression. Sleep problems. Alcohol misuse and abuse. And problem gambling. Those are the top 5. As we get later on down the list, we've got eating disorders, we've got other substances, we've got the bullying and the cyberbullying, especially with the advancements in technology. We've seen increases in the traumatic stressors within this group, this population. In 8 weeks, we've lost 4 performers and elite athletes to suicide death. In 8 weeks, we've lost 4. So Katie Meyer from Stanford University, an elite athlete, collegiate soccer player. Lauren Burnett, an elite softball player from James Madison University. Naomi Judd, who needs no other introduction. And Kalia Posey, just yesterday. She was 16 years old from the Toddlers and Tiaras. She was the contortionist. Performers and elite athletes are at higher risk for injury, and later stages of these injuries to our mental, emotional, and behavioral health can be fatal. And why is this relevant for a problem gambling conference? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the continuum of mental, emotional, and behavioral health, and where the behavioral health concerns can shift that pendulum and advance our experiences of dis-ease and disease. I mentioned that the entourage plays a huge role in reducing stigma around the discussion of mental health. But also, when I say that we all have to be accountable and responsible, is that we have to operate from the understanding that mental health, it's comprehensive. It's not binary in thinking, the ways that I described before. Somebody isn't either mentally healthy or mentally ill, right? Mental, emotional, behavioral health exists on a continuum. And we're the agents for defining for the entire system that mental, emotional, behavioral health is comprehensive, that it's non-discriminatory, and it's non-binary. I also wanted to help you identify some barriers to help seeking. Stigma is a big one. difficulty or unwillingness to express emotion, lack of problem awareness, lack of time, denial of problems, scared of what might happen, impacts on abilities to train, serve, or perform, not sure who to reach out to, accessibility, and belief that it won't help anyway. How many of those do you believe that us, as the managers of the ecosystem or the entourage, how many of those do you believe we can have an impact on? Yes. All of them. So I always like to share something that I came up with in the middle of the night one night using the restroom. That's when I come up with all my good stuff. It's a true story. I always tell people I'm a Back to the Future nerd, and so I equate it to Doc Brown hitting his head on the bathroom and coming up with a flux capacitor, the thing that makes time travel possible. So I didn't hit my head, but, well, maybe I hit my head. But this is what I came up with when I was trying to illustrate mental health, emotional, and behavioral health as a continuum. We all enter the spectrum the moments that we deprioritize our self-care, the moments that we lose or we reach an ineffective management of all the things that we consume. And not to limit our ideas about consumption to just food and beverage and substance consumption, but consumption of messages, consumption of energies through activity, right? The people that we're around, the environments that we're in. If we lose management of that, if it's ineffective, we all have this onset into this spectrum. So one of the things that I hope that resonates with you today is that there is no us and them. You know, we're all kind of one loss, one tragedy away from being on the spectrum, and we're all confronted with that decision point at that point. Are we going to be creative or destructive? And destructive behaviors, a town like Las Vegas, I tell people all the time, it's the most spiritual place in the world because we all confront, whether you want to call it angels, demons, light, dark, good, bad, sin city. We're all confronted with that decision point to be either creative or destructive. And we have the means, Las Vegas, like a place like no other, we have the means to be able to do either one, right? So what influences our decisions to be either creative or destructive? Our entourage, the managers of our system, they influence our decisions, they impact our decisions. If we, and I always tell people, I kind of treat it like playing basketball in the summers, going to the park, where as a kid, we line everybody up on the half-court line, and then we have two captains, and the captains are like, I got you, I got you. I was always one of the first ones picked. But essentially what we're doing is we're empowering the young people to choose their squad, choose their team. And that's something that I don't know why we've gotten away from it as adults. Because we can do the same things. We can choose our teams. And what we've done in binary ways of thinking is we think that if we are completely selfless, then we are not and never selfish. But if we are selfish, we are not selfless, you know? We think that, oh, I can't use people in relationships. I use people all the time, and I say this, I'm not a bad person. I say this in this way. I have a group of friends, and there's one friend, I'm a foodie, she's a foodie, so I know this relationship, anytime I want to go out to eat, get some good food, get some comfort food, you guys had brownies and potato chips before I got here, right? Anytime I need to get some access to that good food that I don't gain weight until 24 years later, I'll call that one friend. Anytime that I'm like, God, I got to go to the gym, I got to work out, I got to do something to work off the food I just ate with my other friend, I'll call that friend. It's the same thing in relationships. There's this misconception that it has to be 50-50 all the time. But rather, relationships are fluid. And the reason why I bring up relationships is because the opposite of addiction and gambling, addiction to substances. The opposite of suicide, the opposite of mental health crisis is not the absence of it, but it's healthy relationships. So if we better understand how to initiate, how to nurture a healthy relationship, the more equipped we are to be resilient in our life circumstances. Relationships look like 80-20, 70-30. I'm not that great at math, so I'm not going to go too much further than that. But they're fluid. In certain areas, I may be able to give 80%. And then I choose my squad. Who can give me 20? And in some areas, I can only give 20%. But I choose my squad. Who can give me 80? And I've got some professionals on my squad. I've got a therapist. She doesn't like me much. I play cat and mouse. I'm like, I know what you're doing. But you got to have your formal supports. You know, you got to have your informal supports. As formal supports, we've got to do better to empower our informal supports. We've got to find ways to help empower and educate through pathways of care. And for some of us, that's a huge challenge because there are times where I'm like, what pathway to care? Right? How do we create? How do we get together and get creative in building those bridges so that people are supported? Well, we come to awesome conferences like this one. I'm checking the time because I know I can talk forever. I'm going to skip ahead. I want to skip ahead to this slide. For those of you, the kids really love QR codes, man, I tell you. So I try to stay hip. I try to keep my presentations current and throw a few QR codes in there. But this is a link to the sports mental health recognition tool. So if you got your phones, you could actually go to your camera, scan the code, and it should bring up a form from the International Olympic Committee that gives you some of the warning signs that somebody might be in crisis. It gives you some high-level actions to encourage or be a connector in the pathways to care. So that's a great resource. And if you don't get it, I'm going to give the slides, or they already have the slides here, and you'll have access to that. But I want to make sure you laid eyes on that. Oh, sorry. Also want to leave a few resources up for you. We got the Problem Gambling HelpLine there, National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, near and dear to my heart. And then coming in July of 2022, which feels like tomorrow, is we'll be able to dial 988 to replace 911 for mental health crises. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. In the state of Nevada, yeah, please. The state of Nevada is leading the country in its implementation plans for 988. We've got some incredible professionals spearheading that. We've got the number for the Nevada Council on Problem Gambling and the state offices for suicide prevention, both north and south. For anybody who wants to continue this conversation with me, to reach me, to read through some of the materials that I've touched on today, please visit www.reachinnow.com. Reach In Now, what the service offering is it's a three-pronged approach where we offer accredited trauma-informed training. There's an online self-paced course that is accredited for college credits, and it's accredited for professional development. So it gets your CEs. So that's one approach, is the online self-paced training, and then we've also got workshops where we do some activation events. I myself visit health worker agencies and facilities. I visit schools, campuses. I work with grades 6 to 12. I visit colleges and universities and work with athletic teams and sports clubs. I visit criminal justice departments, work with Department of Probation and probationers, and also clinical teams. So that's the second arm or car to this transformer. And then the third is the technology piece. Like I told you guys, and next time you see me, I'll have a zip-up hoodie. We've got the mobile application, Reach In Now. Sorry.
Last presentation of the day.
Yeah, and it's the last slide of the day.
Man, we really are. Oh.
Sorry.
No, I don't know. Hey, we're there.
Cool, cool. Thank you so much. Man, I can hang out with you guys. Here's some of my contact information to get in touch with me. And that QR code is there for looks, but it'll take you right to the website. And that concludes my presentation for today. Thank you so much.